Now, ProTaper has sent us quite a few products here. ProTaper is actually making clutch perches. They've made throttle tubes for a long time. Sprockets, obviously, for a while. Chain, this is something new for them. They're building a PT520MX. It's a new ProTaper chain. We're going to try it. I've never tried a ProTaper chain, but ProTaper sprockets, ProTaper handlebars. I mean, I've used fat bars. I think we've all used ProTaper bars at one point, but I am a big crossbar fan. I like riding and having the crossbar in front of me. But ProTaper has actually come up with something a little bit different, that they built a fusion bar, and you can detach the crossbar just by taking the crossbar pad off. It actually slides through this piece that they built. The crossbar detaches, and then it's kind of like a shock absorber, more or less, just guiding through this piece here. The handlebar never really flexes that much. It only takes the shock out of it, so it does slide through there a little bit. You will see some wear maybe, but a little bit excited to try this product. I think it's going to work really good. The grips, I think they're pretty self-explanatory, just half waffle, medium grip. One thing I want to bring everyone's attention to is the new clutch perch that ProTaper has built and produced. And I've never actually used it myself in track conditions, but just the construction of it, the way it's built, I think it's going to work really well. It actually flexes backwards when you crash, and obviously a quick adjust. Most perches do, but the quality of this and the CNC machine work of this is, plus it's got the Teflon ring in here, just the workmanship of it, I want it on my bike. So now we're going to move on to the ProTaper chain and sprocket. We're going to do something a little bit different, along with showing you how to properly change your sprockets and install a chain. We're also going to make a little bit of a change to this motorcycle. We're going to go to a larger diameter front sprocket and a larger diameter rear sprocket. So we're going to go to a 14 front and a 53 rear. Standard is a 13 front and a 48 rear. That's going to allow us to have a longer chain and take a little bit of that chain torque away from the motorcycle, which is going to take chain torque out of the equation when referring to suspension, cornering, aspects of riding on the track. It gives you a better feel. It takes the chain torque out of the equation when you're riding and what you feel through the suspension. So let's get to it, and I'll explain a little bit as I go. So we're going to start with taking the standard OE front sprocket guard off, and it's a plastic guard held by two 8mm head bolts. It has a aluminum case saver underneath it, which I'll show you as soon as I get this off. So this is the standard case saver. Next, we're going to bend the lock washer so we could get the nut off the counter sprocket here. I take a chisel just to get underneath it and tap it a few times to pry it up. Next, I like to take a socket that's a little bit larger than what we're going to use to take the counter sprocket off, and so it gets over the lip of the nut that holds the counter sprocket on, and that'll allow us to evenly bend that washer straight. Next, we're going to have to break the nut loose off the counter sprocket. This is the reason I left the chain still intact. I haven't taken it off yet. It'll brace the sprocket a bit and allow us to get some torque on this. I'm going to use an impact wrench. that's going to allow us to break that loose. You can do it with a breaker bar or some other things, some other tools, but really this is the easiest and quickest. I use an electric one, but you can use an air or different types. Now we're going to pull the washer off, and we're going to leave that alone right now. We're going to move on to the chain, taking the master link off. There are many different ways to take your master link off. You could do it with a pair of pliers that most people do it with. I use a straight screwdriver, and you could do it with your hand or a hammer, but I use a hammer, and I lay my straight screwdriver right up against the edge of that lock key, and I just give it a tap and pops it straight forward and off. Then we can remove the master link. Maybe. We could just sit this right down. And you can just pull the chain off the bike. Now we're going to break the sprocket bolts loose, actually the nut on the back side, which is a 12, and bracing the tire with your hand, and my knee is the way I do it. You can push down. The bolt will spin, but as long as you get that nut loose and started, that's what the whole objective of this is. And you want to make sure you have a long enough wrench that you have enough leverage on these, just to make sure that it comes loose as easy as possible. Now you're going to use your impact wrench again with an 8mm Allen head socket on here. We can put it right into the bolt itself and put your 12 wrench on the back. And now that we've already loosened it, we can just spin them right off. You want to make sure you leave the bolts in, or they'll hit the swing arm when you spin the wheel around. So make sure the bolts are placed back in if they do screw out. Next, we're going to want to loosen the rear axle nut and spin it loose. And then you can just loosen it with your hand once you break the nut loose. Take the washer and the adjuster off. Then you can just easily pound the axle out and slide your rear wheel right out. Now that we have the wheel off the bike and the sprocket nuts off the sprocket, I've laid the tire down. We're working on carpet here, so I've laid it down on carpet, but make sure that you have a rag underneath it or something underneath it that's clean, that won't allow dirt to get up into your bearings or the spacer or on your disc. Very important. You don't want grease or dirt on your disc. Now simply just raise your sprocket off. Now we're going to replace the sprocket with a ProTaper sprocket, 53 tooth. I always like to lay my sprocket on the hub and just give it an easy turn back and forth. Make sure there's nothing disrupting the sprocket between the sprocket and the hub. And then I drop my bolts back in to the sprocket. I take my washer and nut. It is a self-locking nut, so we won't have to put any Loctite on it. And I lay the washer on top of the nut and put it between two fingers and start it on the bolt, just hand tightening it. So we have the nuts started on the bolts. Now I'm going to take my 12 wrench again and put it in place on the nut, and put my 8mm Allen with my impact, and I'm just going to snug it up. Now I want to go all the way to the other side, so you're doing it on each side of the sprocket. Now the bolts are fairly tight, but we're going to give it a final torque once we get the wheel back onto the bike. Now that we're going to run the axle back in the, well, not the farthest position back, but quite a ways back, we're going to want to support these chain adjuster bolts. If you adjust them really far out with the axle to the back position, it just puts a lot of leverage on these bolts. So we're actually going to support those bolts a little bit. So we're going to need to take the bolts out, and that's very simple. You just take your 12 wrench that you've been working with the wheel out. You can slide it all the way up onto the nut with the box end, and still with our impact wrench, we're going to loosen this chain adjuster bolt. And all you have to do is loosen the nut, the lock nut, and then run the bolt out. You want to loosen the nut first, back your wrench off, keeping it centered on the bolt, and then just run your bolt out. Now that we have the chain adjuster bolts out, what I like to do, even though this is a new bike, I like to clean off this area just to make sure there's no dirt and the standard grease that they use to put the wheel on. I just want to wipe that off. And then take the nut and run the nut quite a ways back, almost bottoming it against the head of the chain adjuster bolt. And then I like to put a little grease on the threads just to make sure that we don't have any corrosion in there once we start washing the bike and whatnot. It doesn't take much, just a little. Now we're going to put these spacers in there that's actually going to support this, that we're going to be adjusted pretty far back out. So we want to run this spacer in there. And you want to hand start this a few threads in. Make sure that we get it started. Now once you have it started, you can actually take your wrench or a T-handle, either way, and I'm just going to slowly run it up. So now we're going to put the rear wheel back in place. You want to turn the rear wheel a little bit sideways and slide it straight up in there and in place. Now we're going to replace the adjuster plate, the washer over the threads, and the nut back in place, and just thread it, snug it hand tight. Make sure the wheel's all the way back, and then just hand tighten the nut. So we're going to move back to the counter sprocket. We've left our standard 13 counter sprocket on the bike, and now we're going to remove that and replace it with this ProTaper 14 tooth front sprocket. So you can see the difference in the size. And now that we got the counter sprocket back in place, we are going to replace the lock washer. Now I've made a small modification to this one. I've just taken off that piece that was flapped over from the manufacturer. It was a bit boogered up, so I just felt that I wanted to get it off there, and I'll use one of these other flaps that they've made for you. Now we're going to place the lock washer back on the counter shaft, and you have to line the spline up with those grooves that are on the washer. And then you want to take your nut and hand tighten that. Just hold your sprocket in one of the tooth grooves and give it a good turn. Next step is to put the chain on. I've actually put gloves on for this just because a new chain has grease on it. Just don't want to get my hands greasy. And you can put the chain on the teeth of the rear sprocket, and I'm just going to walk it right up. And you want to lay, once you get it through the chain guide, you want to lay it on the sprocket, push your wheel forward, and you might need to adjust your bolts doing that, and then you can put your chain together. Next, we're going to replace the master link, and we can slide that into the holes. Put the other side of the link on. Make sure it's pushed all the way on so your grooves are showing. And then you want to put your clip in place. Now to put the clip on, we're actually going to use a pair of pliers. I know we took it off with a straight screwdriver, but pliers seem to be easier going back on. And you want to get behind the link. Oh, let me point out one more thing. Always put your master link clip facing the back of the bike. So if the chain, if your master link is on the top rail of the chain, you want the clip facing backwards. That way it's always going with the solid side forward. That way it'll keep it from popping off. If you put it on the other way, sometimes it'll hit the chain guide and pop your master link clip off. So the next step, we're going to tighten our counter sprocket up. I'm going to actually click it into gear just to make sure that the wheel doesn't spin when I do this, and take the slack out of the chain. And now you can, I want to do it the right way. Just a couple little blasts with a wrench will be good. Now you're going to want to bend that lock washer over, and what we're going to do is just get a hold of it, give it a little bend just to start it, and then you're going to fold it the rest of the way to the nut. Now we're going to tighten up the bolts on the rear sprocket. I've taken the 8mm off our impact wrench and put it on a ratchet. We've already given it a blast with the impact wrench, so I know it's pretty snug, but you want to get your 12 wrench and your 8mm with a ratchet, 8mm Allen with a ratchet, and you're going to want to hold the bolt in place, and you want to tighten the nut. Try not to spin the bolt, just things get off whack and you'll end up stripping those Allen heads out. I like to push my knee up against the wheel when I'm doing this. It just holds it, gives me a little more leverage. Next, we're going to adjust the chain. We've just kind of tightened those adjuster bolts up just to have them in place. And now we're going to actually, first time is take a look at our chain adjustment. I always like to use 3 fingers to adjust the chain, 3 fingers behind the swing arm buffer, and I keep my fingers in place and I use my tin wrench to actually tighten the chain adjuster bolts and try to get it in the ballpark. And you can feel the chain actually getting snugger and snugger as I tighten this bolt. So you want to do both sides evenly. You don't want to get the rear wheel cocked one way or the other. So this side is actually a little too tight, and so we're going to have to loosen this side. And you can see it with the adjusters on the adjuster plate here. Now we're going to look at the adjuster notches. We're on 4 on this side, and we're actually on 3 on the brake side. And the chain is a little loose, so we're going to tighten up the brake side a little bit. Actually, we're going to tighten up the sprocket side a little bit. We're going to put it at 3, and it's getting closer. And we will even it up a little bit over here. So it feels pretty good right now to me. We are on 3. Now we're on 3 on both sides, and that actually feels a little tight. So we're going to loosen this side again. Now that we have our chain pretty close, we're going to want to snug the chain up to pull everything forward to the chain adjuster bolts. I like to put a rag in here and roll it back in the sprocket, between the sprocket and the chain. And then you can put your wrench back on the axle nut and tighten her up. Don't over tighten it yet, because we want to make sure that our chain feels proper when we let the tension off the chain. Make sure you get it pretty snug. And it feels good. And it looks like we're even on both sides. We're just a little past the 3 notch on both sides on the adjuster plates. Now that I'm happy with the chain tension and the alignment of the rear wheel, I'm going to put my rag back between the sprocket and the chain and get the chain taut again. That brings the axle forward up against the adjuster bolts. And I'm going to give my axle nut a final tighten. Now you want to refer to the torque spec in your owner's manual when doing this, but I've done this a few times, so I can get pretty close. Now the axle's tight and the adjuster plate is pressed up against the adjuster bolt. Now I want to thread the nut in along with our spacer. You just want to do that slowly. Let's just support our adjuster bolt with our tin wrench and do these together. Now, instead of replacing the stock case saver and counter sprocket cover, we're actually going to put one that I built on there. Little stronger, little thicker, and you'll have to change the bolts for it. Let's start the top first. And then move to the bottom bolt. We'll grab an 8T and just turn the bolts in. Don't over tighten it. Tighten it up and then turn it about a quarter turn back. And what I like to do is get the play. There's a little bit of play in it. I like to get the play out of it and then snug it up. As you can see, replacing the chain and sprocket is a fairly simple job. One thing I want to point out that going to the larger diameter sprockets, going to a 53 rear sprocket, 14 front sprocket, is the ratio is 3.79, and the standard 13 front sprocket and 48 rear sprocket is a 3.69. So we've only changed it 1/10, which is really nothing. Most riders wouldn't feel that. But what we have done is we've gone to a larger diameter chain and gotten the chain up off the swing arm so it's not rubbing the swing arm in places, and actually the diameter is larger. So it's changing the chain torque, taking the chain torque out of the equation when you ride. So the bike is not going to feel any different like it would if you went to a larger sprocket without changing the front sprocket. This, we're doing it and we're keeping it the same ratio is what comes standard. We're just changing the chain torque a bit. You can buy these products here at Chaparral. You can order them online. You can call in on our 800 number, or you can visit us here in San Bernardino.